Today, I'm going to tell you exactly when the Bitcoin ETF is going to be approved, and it is precisely on this day that Bitcoin will be sent to Valhalla, dragging with it altcoins into positive ROI territory and sending our bags thusly and promptly to Valhalla. Well, of course, this is speculative, so we could be wrong here. But let's go ahead and dig into a very nice research thread about what is likely to happen with the Bitcoin ETF. Understanding, of course, that its approval and when it is approved could be one of the biggest inflection points in the entire history of Bitcoin as an asset. But wait, what's that? Oh yes, the video that we filmed yesterday now needs an update because Mr. Gensler and the SEC have decided to update their filing requirements, saying that the US SEC deems the spot Bitcoin ETF filings as inadequate. Now you might be thinking, no, they're just trying to throw this thing out. BlackRock, sorry, we don't care. We don't care that you're BlackRock. We don't care that you're the biggest rock and the blackest rock. We're just gonna chuck your application out like yesterday's lunch. Well, actually, this isn't that bad, and it doesn't even alter what I think of as the perceived timeline here. Let's read on. In the eyes of the SEC, the exchanges should have named the spot Bitcoin exchange in which they would have had a surveillance sharing agreement with, or provided sufficient information about the details of those surveillance agreements. However, asset managers can resubmit filings after clarifying the information. So apparently this is just really a technicality and shouldn't overall impact really anything but a quick amendment to the filing. And I don't think it even impacts key decision point dates. This is just a little bit of a technicality, but we'll see how big of a stumbling block it becomes. Check out Huff here. I just followed this guy. He's got a fantastic thread here on the Bitcoin ETF. We're going to go through it and explain what it means and what we can start planning on as far as trading these important dates and how he's positioning over the coming weeks. I'll give you my opinion as we go. So here is the entire timeline, but we're going to go through it step by step. First of all, outside of the filing of the BlackRock ETF, we want to understand what other important dates there are that are swirling around this Bitcoin ETF. Remember, Grayscale sued the SEC last year for not letting them convert their Grayscale Bitcoin trust into a spot Bitcoin ETF. Now, the court decision is actually due out any time in the next few weeks and months. The clock is ticking, and it paves the way for a potential ETF if it's successful. This is why BlackRock's filing is probably not a coincidence, and many legal experts are arguing that Grayscale actually has a very good chance of winning its lawsuit against the SEC. Here's why. You see, the SEC has approved a futures ETF. In fact, they've even approved now a 2x leverage futures ETF. And the argument that the SEC was using is that we cannot approve a spot Bitcoin ETF because there's too much manipulation. However, the data shows that the price for the spot Bitcoin ETF trades in lockstep 99.9% of the time with the futures ETF. So if these things trade in the same way, the price is exactly the same, then how can you argue that the spot Bitcoin ETF is manipulated and the futures ETF, which has the exact same pricing, is not manipulated? Then you allowed leverage on top of the futures ETF, so whatever manipulation you're claiming might exist is now multiplied. There is simply no argument for protecting investors under this particular logic. The logic is done, dusted, and out the door. Therefore, it should come as no surprise that experts suggest up to 80% chance of Grayscale winning this lawsuit, considering that this argument is effectively what they're using, which is that you can't approve a futures ETF and not a spot Bitcoin ETF. But let's go back in time. Why exactly would the SEC not want a spot Bitcoin ETF? Well, the answer is very simple. The futures ETF doesn't actually buy Bitcoin. They don't need to hold any Bitcoin to run this ETF. And so it doesn't put any buy pressure on the global Bitcoin market. However, the spot Bitcoin ETF absolutely does. In order to have this spot Bitcoin ETF, the actual ETF vehicle goes out and buys Bitcoin from the global market, which effectively creates a scarcity and it drives up the price. If you drive up the price of Bitcoin, we know you also drive up the price of Ethereum and all of these other crypto coins, which are currently entrenched in lawsuits with the SEC. By adding a spot Bitcoin ETF, you essentially make it way harder to litigate against the entire crypto ecosystem. And more importantly, you could create a massive generational bull run across the entire crypto space. We know that there's no data showing that Bitcoin goes on these massive runs in the last 8 years or so without taking the altcoins with it. And that's just how the game works. So now we know why they don't want the spot Bitcoin ETF, but might be forced to do it because legally there's no argument to allow a futures ETF without the spot Bitcoin ETF. At any rate, the court decision is due out any time in the next few weeks and months. So if Grayscale wins that, it essentially would open the floodgates for all Bitcoin ETFs. That's probably why BlackRock filed. Now, if you look at this initial timeline, you might think that the initial deadline here is August 12th and that we're essentially in a news vacuum until then. But according to Huff here, this is wrong because ARK Invest actually filed their own ETF in April and they'll be getting some sort of decision very soon as well. So considering that we can't actually predict the exact day that we might get a decision from the Grayscale case, we must look effectively to August 12th, which is the first meaningful day that we will have some decision based around the BlackRock ETF from the SEC. And if you ask me, letting BlackRock go first would be at least the way that the SEC sort of bends the knee to traditional finance while effectively opening the floodgates to this new crypto paradigm and a Bitcoin spot ETF. Huff's view here is that a delay is the most likely, but I'm not actually so sure. You see, the argument against the Bitcoin spot ETF is being attacked in court, and the courts have not been friendly to the SEC of late. In fact, check out this clip from Jay Clayton, who ran the SEC before Gary Gensler, and he had this to say about the current SEC.
Let's take this to a very high level on the regulatory side. What you're hearing from the leaders of the regulatory organizations is if we're not losing cases, if we're not being pushed back on by the courts, we're not doing enough. Think about that for a second. That is a fundamental shift in how we as Americans view the role of the government. I don't want to be in a place where I know the government is going to bring cases they think they're going to lose. Imagine you're the person who is the subject of that case. Now, we're talking about corporations.
Yeah, to see if they can. And if they're not stopped, they're going to, yeah.
Right, but this is an ethos now, which is unless we're losing, we're not bringing enough cases. That may be fine for private litigants against each other and think about it. But when you have the power of the state and you're supposed to only bring cases and only make rules that you think are going to pass judicial muster.
So there you have the most recent chairman of the SEC, Jay Clayton, essentially saying this isn't the way this is supposed to go. You have literally everyone across the political spectrum pretty much saying that this SEC flies in the face of all precedents and is not really behaving the way a regulator should. Again, I'm no expert here, obviously, I'm a crypto fan, but it doesn't seem crazy that the courts would at least support a spot Bitcoin ETF here. So that news could really drop any time between now and August 12th. In fact, normally I would agree that the SEC would delay, but if they know that the writing's on the wall here, it might just make sense for them to let the BlackRock ETF through and actually show that they're not so unreasonable. It would be a tactical move to show that they are not so one-sided on the crypto issue, but that they have a logical approach and that they wanted to let one of the most trusted custodians, one of the most trusted institutions go through and pass through first, effectively anointing BlackRock the king of all Bitcoin ETF creators. All right, so I actually really like this wrap up. If ETF is approved, Bitcoin skyrockets to 100K, alts rocket, ETH rockets, we all rocket. Just for the boomers here, some rocket power. If it's delayed, which is probably the most likely here besides an approval, then Bitcoin just chops around. And if it's somehow rejected here and all of these just get rejected over and over again, continuing the trend of rejections, well, then I guess Bitcoin would go down here and start retesting some of those low regions. Again, this feels like the least likely of the scenarios, but who knows? It's always these big moments that you get these huge opportunities here in crypto land. For me, I'm not 100% with all of my cash in the market just in case the market gives us a gift. Then again, I want to be clear, I kind of agree with Rookie here. You see the chart showing that if Bitcoin rips up here past 32, we should see a massive jump here to the $40,000 region, at which time we'd probably go back into a semi-easy mode part of the market where narratives would start ripping in altcoins and it would be easy to start multiplying your coins. Once again, the beginning of something much more bullish. So the question is the risk of being out of the market greater than the risk of being in the market? I personally have been deploying methodically into the market. I have plenty of cash to deploy if there's a huge drop down, but in the end, I do think that the risk of being out of the market, if Bitcoin does rip up to 100K with a Bitcoin ETF approval, with all of these factors, the legal cases, the actual political pressure on the SEC to do something, the very real argument that the Bitcoin spot ETF could not be manipulated more than a futures ETF, especially when you add 2x leverage, which is the recent Bitcoin futures ETF that was just approved, there's just no legal basis to stop a spot Bitcoin ETF. You sprinkle on a little of that BlackRock magic, and I just cannot imagine that the risk of being sidelined right now when Bitcoin could hit a God candle to 100K is more than the risk of Bitcoin chopping lower to the tune of 30% or so. Now, I wanted to bring this up because just 2 hours ago, we have word that the Supreme Court has struck down Biden's student debt relief program. Now, what's really interesting about this is that they use the same logic, the major doctrines question, to effectively strike down this student debt relief, saying, hey, look, the executive branch, the president, has decided to alleviate student debt. But this is a huge issue facing the entire economy. So it should be up to Congress, the legislature, to actually pass legislation to change that piece of the economy. And this is the highest court in the United States effectively using the same legal language that Coinbase is using to oppose the SEC's lawsuit against them. This is a huge step, and it shows, in my opinion, a huge indicator that the Supreme Court in the United States will side with Coinbase and will side with crypto in essentially forcing Congress to make the rules around this industry, that it will not be up to the SEC to just universally enforce its own will. And this is something that I think is going to be seen or foreshadowing one of the biggest victories in crypto history. Let me know what you think in the comments below. As always, I hope you enjoyed this one. I'm EllioTrades. Let me know what you think about the Bitcoin spot ETF dates. Again, here we are on ETF roller coaster land. As always, I'm EllioTrades. Let's see you very soon on the next episode.